Welcome to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Hey, that's me. Hi, and welcome to Positive Talk. Our show features the best positive stories and people from around the globe as we endeavor to answer the universal question of why am I here and what is my purpose? Understanding that can change everything, and knowing your greatness is fundamental to living your best life. So join us right now as together we work to create the adventure of our lifetime. I gotta tell you, I'm having a great time here on this particular day. I've got to interview some great people, and I get to interview another one right now. He is an author. He's written fiction. He's written nonfiction. He's got a bunch of books. He's got a brand new book out. It's called Bright College Years, which I believe that's your newest one, Andrew. Is it? Yes, it is. Bright College Years. It really is a fun book to go back and review your college years, if you had them. I didn't have any college years because I didn't go. But Andrew Pessin is with us. Pessin, right?
Pessin, that's right.
Oh, very nice. How are you, young man?
I am fine. Thank you for calling me young man. You just made my day. Talking about positive thinking right there. I loved your intro, by the way. It's very uplifting. It's a wonderful intro to your show.
Well, thank you. It's one of those things that I wrote with somebody else, and we spent a whole lot of time, as you know, being a writer, wordsmithing, because we wanted to get the exact wording correct of what we were trying to say. And sometimes for non-writers, like I consider myself kind of I can do some copy and stuff, but I'm not really a writer, and it takes a long time to figure that out.
It does. You know, the famous writer Flaubert, as in Madame Bovary, 19th century French writer, he once said, someone asked him, how was your weekend? And he said, oh, it was incredibly productive. And they said, oh, well, what did you do? He said, well, I spent all day Saturday deciding to insert a comma in a certain sentence, and then I spent all day Sunday deciding to remove it. He said, so that is the writer's life, right? If you really care about your words, that comma is important. And it took a whole weekend to finally, reach a resolution about it. How he managed to complete a whole novel at that pace, or many novels for that matter, is a little hard to figure out. But it does tell you something about dedication to one's craft and perfectionism, right? Like the importance of that comma.
Yeah, I guess.
Maybe not healthy. I don't know. If you need to get some copy turned out, the last thing you want to do is spend 48 hours just deciding on a comma. However, if you are aiming for, I don't know, masterpiece writing, then maybe that comma is the difference between something that's very good and something that's really, to the next level. So maybe he is famous and celebrated, so perhaps he knew what he was doing.
Well, and that's me and a friend of mine. We spent a lot of time working on just the term "know your greatness." Because,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No. I mean, right? You need a slogan, you need a brand, right? And
know your greatness. Is it? Are you already great? Or are you searching to become great? Which is it? And so it was like, learn your greatness, act your great. So we went through all of these words to get to know your greatness, because you were born great. And we all were.
Right. And everyone's got something in them that is great, and know your greatness. I also like that it has that connotation, which is search for your greatness, come to find it because it's there. Right. And then once you've got it, you know it, obviously. But if you're commanded to know it, then you have to search for it. So that's very, very uplifting.
That really is brilliant. I hadn't even thought of that.
But you know what? The best writing, it's not all conscious, right? It's not like in advance exactly what you're looking for in the phrase. When you found it, it felt right, it resonated. And maybe the reason it resonated was because it actually has several layers of meaning, all of which sort of work nicely together. So you might not have been consciously aware of that, but the fact that you selected that slogan says something. So you found your greatness in that slogan, or at least one piece of your greatness in finding that slogan.
Exactly. Well, thank you very much. I'll pat myself on the back now.
Yeah, I would pat you were I 3,000 miles further away from here.
Are you on the East Coast?
I am on the East Coast, yes.
Oh, very good. Now, is it as hot as it's been?
Today, no. We had a nice heat spell. I guess we got our heat dome for a few days, but today it's like sunny and 70s, and these are the handful of days that it's lovely to be in New England.
New England. It's a great place. I haven't been there yet, and aim to get there. And now that Bill Belichick is retired, and
Was he
and
keeping
Tom
you away?
Brady, yeah, because they kept on beating my poor Seahawks.
Yeah, right. Well, we suck now, so you're welcome. Come, and you also have a friend now, so you're welcome to come visit.
Exactly. I would love to. And Andrew, how many books have you written?
I want to say 12 or 13 or 14, somewhere in there.
It's amazing to me because I talked to a bunch of writers, and a lot of them will say, I don't know. I think it's about. I would be counting them like on the shelf every day. That's just 5, 6, 7, 8, 9.
I think when they were up like 6, 7, 8, I was counting them, but then after a while, it gets a little hard to remember. I also have sort of a couple of new books that are just about finished. I'm not sure about where they will be published or how they'll be published, but so they don't exist in the world yet. But I do have somewhere between 12 and 14 in the world.
So, what's the process like for you when you're writing? Do you come up with the style, the characters? I know there are all kinds of different styles,
Right.
And you do both nonfiction and fiction.
Right. So if we want to focus on fiction for a bit, which I'm happy to, I will say that early in my life, I knew I wanted to write fiction, and I even did some writing early on, a tiny little bit in high school. And then after I graduated from college, I went to live in California for a couple of years. And as I like to say, those 2 years in California, although at this point, only roughly 1/30th of my life, probably, I don't know, 60% of the stories I tell about my life come from those 2 years in California. And one of the things I was doing there was I wanted to try being a writer. So I spent a lot of that 2 years writing fiction. And, most of it was horrendous. But if, people are looking for advice for writing, if you have some aspiring writers in your audience, I think what seems to be true is you have to write a lot of bad stuff before you finally figure out what you want to say and figure out how you want to say it and finally find your greatness or at least your talent or wherever that is. And so although what I wrote in those 2 years was really not very good, it was necessary to get to the point where when I finally had time years later to pursue fiction writing a little bit more fully, I was sort of ready to go to that next level. And I will say I was very gratified that one of the first stories that I wrote back in California, which was pretty lousy, as I said, like most of what I wrote there, I ended up using it, and it ends up basically being the closing chapter of my current novel, revised and improved, of course. But it was very gratifying that even though I had come to terms with the fact that I'd spent 2 years writing a bunch of stuff that I was basically going to throw away and never publish, I was able to mine that stuff and pull out something, and it found new life as the closing chapter, basically, of my current novel. So it was a very sort of gratifying thing 30 years later, of course.
Well, now, explain this to me, because you sit down and you write a book or you write a manuscript or a screenplay or something. And how do you know it's not any good? Because you wrote it. And so then you go back and you reread it and go, oh, I can't believe I wrote that. Or is that...
So your question is, how do you know it's not any good, or how do you know it is any good?
How do you know, since you wrote it,
right.
I would think that you would go, this is really good. This is really good. And even when you rewrote it or reread it,
right,
it would be really good. But how do you know when you think it's good when you write it and then you read it later and it's not as good as you thought when you wrote it?
This is an excellent probing question there. I know for me, at least, especially when I'm writing fiction, the early drafts are terrible. But that's okay, because for me, I've never really suffered from writer's block, at least not yet. And I think the reason is I know that anything that I'm writing isn't or doesn't have to be the final draft. It can be removed, it can be improved, it can be, reworked in all sorts of different ways. And so that allows the words just to flow. And so when I'm at the early stages of something, words are flowing, it's not necessarily coherent, and it almost certainly is not good. So unlike what you were suggesting, at least in the early phases, there's very little that I write that I think is good. But then once I've got a whole bunch of words on the page, and that is the hardest part, is the blank page, putting words on the page. But precisely because I don't demand that those words be any good, they flow. And once I have a whole bunch of words on the page, then I'm in the point where I can say, you know what? there's something in this part right here that I think isn't bad, right? And then I can extract that part and really focus on it and begin trying to make it good. So I'm very aware of how terrible my early drafts are. But then your question goes deeper. As I begin revising, the way I think of it is the first draft or so, like for a sculptor, the first thing you got to do is carve off a big chunk of marble from somewhere to work with, right? So the first draft is just that big chunk of marble, and and that's hard work to cut that out of the quarry and then lift it and bring it to your house. So it's hard work, but what you have isn't a sculpture yet. It's not any good as a sculpture, and then you carve away and get a general shape of it, and then you begin to say, oh, now I see what I want to accomplish in here. And then as you get into the fine tuning, then it starts to look like something that maybe is good. But what's absolutely imperative, and what drives me, and this is the reason I write, is I write for myself first and foremost. And again, if I'm offering unsolicited advice to any aspiring writers, you have to have that motivation, because there's no guarantee of any success. There's no guarantee of publication. Even if you get published, there's no guarantee anyone's going to buy it or read it or anything like that. And it's a lot of hard work, and it takes a long time to write a novel. At least for me, it does. And so if I didn't enjoy it and get something out of it for myself, it wouldn't be a smart thing. It wouldn't be a smart use of my time. So my first audience is me. I have to entertain myself. I tend to, even when I don't want to, use humor, and I find myself hilarious. And so I often will be, laughing while I'm writing. I'm finding something hilarious. But the important thing, of course, is in the end, you're not the only judge of your writing. You have to show it to other people. And so there comes that point where you take the thing you've written and you show it to others, and you're asking them, is it any good? Because you need that third person perspective. And there's no reason that their opinion is any better than yours, right? So you may think it's good and they may think it sucks, but you have to, first of all, take their opinion and then ask them to say, well, why did it suck? What didn't work for you? Did you not find this funny? Did you not find this gripping, etc.? And then you might get useful data out of that to make changes. I know for me, once I get going, as you can probably already tell, I can be long-winded. I'm a professor and they pay us by the word, basically. So, I give long lectures on things. So my early drafts are long, and then the hard work comes of cutting out even things that you think are good. Like I have in my current novel, it was at one point probably twice the length that it is in its published form. So there's another, equally thick novel that didn't get published out there, and some of that material was really good. Like there's some stuff in there I really liked, but partly because of feedback I was getting from earlier readers, I realized, what, even if it's good, very few people want to sit and read a 400-page novel or something like that. Those days are gone, as we know, for most people. And so stuff has to come out, even good stuff, and that's the most painful part of writing, because you created it, you like it, it's good, and yet it has to come out, right? And the hope always is I'll find some other use for that somewhere else in some other book or something like that. But removing things is difficult, and what motivates me to move it is precisely the other readers, other eyeballs on it who say, I liked it, but it kind of dragged on. That section went on too long, and so those other eyes help me to see how to improve it. And weirdly, even though it's painful, it's like removing your own organs, like doing a surgeon removing his own kidney or something like that. Once it's gone, I can tell that it's better, right? Everything flows. And I realize that scene didn't actually advance the plot. It didn't enrich or deepen the character. It actually wasn't necessary, even if it was good on its own. And I know that because if I don't miss it once it's gone, then it didn't need to be there. And every once in a while, I will remove something and realize, no, it's got to go back. It's got to go back. And here I am, not to compare myself to Flaubert, who was a great master, but you spend hours taking the thing out, putting the thing in, and hours taking it out, and then hours putting it back in again. But only when you've gone through that process can you at least be confident that it's good, which is the answer to your question, right? Like,
exactly. Now I do have to ask you, which is easier to write? There was a guy who said drama is easy, comedy is hard. Which is easier for you to write? Can you write comedy?
I shouldn't be the judge of it, but yes, all of my all four of my novels are funny. I think I find them funny. Other people have found them funny. So I think I'm writing comedy. However, um, all of them, yeah, all of them are also serious. There's a serious story in them, and there's some emotion, and there's, love and heartbreak and grief, and one of them has a murder, things like that. Two of them have a murder, actually. So I, I don't know if this is good. I know when I started my last novel, I resolved to avoid the humor. And I actually know when I'm reading fiction, I mostly don't like things that are trying to be funny. I want to read like a serious book that grips me, and the greatest works of literature tend to be quite serious. I can't help the humor comes. It's my nature. I set out to write a book without humor, and the humor just came anyway. And so I finally gave up. I'm now committed that novel number 5 is going to be a serious novel with no humor in it, but I broke that promise once before. So I think comedy comes naturally to me, but I'm not claiming good comedy. Other readers may not find it funny, but first I have to find it funny. So I think comedy comes easier, and it's harder for me to do the drama. I have to turn off a part of myself that wants to insert itself when I write the drama.
That's interesting. So the drama is harder for you. Now, I know you said that when you're writing and you write something funny that you'll laugh.
Right.
Does anybody in the room say, "What are you laughing about?"
Yeah. Well, yes, I've had my wife has asked, "What are you laughing at?" And I actually think the funniest line the two funniest lines I ever wrote, both ended up getting cut from their respective novels. And I come back to these lines, and I still, once in a while, I'm walking along and I remember the line and I laugh out loud. And I don't know if I probably shouldn't venture it here. It won't have the same feel, but I will mention one because I still think it's hilarious, but it had to come out even though it was funny. My second novel is called The Irrationalist, and it's a historical murder mystery based very closely on the tragic life and mysterious death of the famous philosopher René Descartes. He's the I think, therefore I am guy. And I know a lot about Descartes because as a philosopher, I am a college professor by day, a philosophy professor, and I did a lot of my own academic work on Descartes and his philosophy. So I was very fascinated by his ideas, and I got to know his life quite well. He had a really tragic life in many ways, and he died under very mysterious circumstances. And at the time, there were rumors that the death was not a natural death, but that he had been murdered. And these were well-founded rumors. He had a lot of enemies. There were a lot of people with means, motive, opportunity, whatever. And so I decided to turn his life into a historical murder mystery. And I solved the murder, by the way, in the course of that. And so this is taking place in the 17th century. The 17th century, like many earlier centuries, was a very cruel time. I mean, like humanity's cruelness to humanity, which we see enough of in the 21st century, 17th century. Oh my God. Whether it was the penal code or the wars, the 30 Years War, which is a massive, essentially like a world war in the 17th century. It was brutal and cruel, no mercy, etc. So at one point there's a criminal, and he's condemned to death. And he's condemned to be executed and quartered, chopped in four. But he's got a good lawyer, and the lawyer manages to reduce the sentence to halving. And to me, that's the funniest line I ever wrote. I put it perfectly, like reduce the sentence to halving. And, if I were to analyze why I find that so funny, it's because it sounds like it's a good thing to have a sentence reduced. But of course, it's not a whole lot better being halved than being quartered, etc. But that line, it didn't make it into the novel, and it was perfect where it was, but the novel was too long, so that particular thing came out. So I do periodically, once in a while, I'm walking along, probably even now, my wife's in the other room, and I'll be sitting on, and I'll just remember that line, and I'll laugh because I really think it's funny. And she will laugh, "What are you laughing at?" "Oh, well, a line I wrote 10 years ago that didn't make it into a book." So so people do ask me, what am I laughing about?
So not to be technical, but I know what it's like if you're going to quarter somebody because you've got 2 arms and 2 legs. Well, although I guess would it be because you got the head and then the 2 arms and the 2 legs, is that quarter or is that fifth? I don't know.
I don't know. You know what? I should have looked that up at the time because like when someone is drawn and quartered, which I think is the phrase,
Exactly.
I do imagine it's just pulling the arms and legs out, but then you're right. That makes 5 pieces. So that should be what's the verb of making into 5? Quintupled? No, I don't even know what it is.
Well, because Mel Gibson in Braveheart, he was drawn and quartered, and they put his head on London Bridge and then they sent the arms and legs to the 4 corners of the.
So that's not quartered, as you're pointing out. That's a fundamental flaw in that concept. That's at least 5 pieces there, or maybe more if they separated the head. That's 6 pieces, right?
I wonder if he could appeal that after the fact.
Get that reduced, yeah. Posthumously reduce it to so if they halved it, person, I don't know which way they would, vertically or horizontally. Neither is good.
Well, and I've got another thing for you, because one of the other things that when they drawed and quartered people, the first thing that went were their genitals.
So I didn't need to hear that. Thank you. I heard your intro and I was uplifted. Now I just came crashing down. But
I'm sorry, I have a bizarre sense of humor.
No, so do I. So you might like The Irrationalist, because one of the key scenes, most of it takes place in Sweden, and they've established a museum. This was a real thing. There was a museum of curiosities because the emperor at the time, and then an emperor at the time, liked to collect weird things. And then when Sweden won the 30 Years' War, the young Queen Christina, who herself was quite a character, ended up taking all these curiosities from the emperor and establishing a museum of curiosities. So there's a scene set in the Museum of Curiosities, and there's a whole room dedicated to different instruments of torture. And and I play that for comedy. So there you go, if you like that sense of humor. But I play that for the torture instruments. But speaking of genitals, that was a very common locus for torture in the 17th century. So many of the instruments were designed to, let us just say, address the genitals in one form or another.
I got to tell you, that would have been. I am so glad that we were not in those times today.
It was unbelievably cruel. I mean, these were, by the way, and every instrument of torture was a real instrument of torture in the 17th century. I did my research on that. So yeah, unbelievably cruel. It had all the cruelness that we have today, but then a whole other layer and level of it. So it was scary times. And yet for me, it was comedy because, as you know, this is possibly Mel Brooks who said this, but comedy is tragedy plus time, right? Yeah. So 17th century, you can make fun of what is actually obviously horrific human cruelty towards other human beings, but partly because it's hundreds of years ago, we can make light of it, even though on some other level, obviously, we can't and we should not.
Well, and I was talking to a medieval specialist, and she was talking about castles.
Uh-huh.
And I said, okay, so where did they go potty in the castle?
Oh, I know an answer to that. Yeah.
Well, and the answer she gave me was that because they had a moat around the castle in a lot of cases, that there was a opening on the outside to the outside, so that you could stick your fanny on the outside, pointing, and then and stuff like that. I would hate to be the person on the first floor.
Or the moat. Yeah. Like, who cleans the moat, if they clean the moat? In fact, in the 17th century, it was not uncommon in these royal castles or these palaces, which would be enormous and have these long corridors. People would just pee in the corner of the corridor, right? Like, they didn't have a bathroom. They would just pee in the corner of the corridor. It was very primitive in those days. And they would dump human waste in the Seine in Paris. I have a scene in that novel too, where they're dumping dung. Let's call it dung, to be polite, in the river Seine, right? The Seine River. So,
yeah,
in some ways we have advanced.
In some ways we haven't.
Right.
In downtown Seattle, by the courthouse and stuff, there's kind of a homeless camp there where people have their tents and stuff like that. Well, there's a peculiar odor.
Yeah.
that permeates the area, and it's kind of like, urine and stuff.
Right.
So and enough of that.
And that's contemporary, so it's not funny at all. It's only tragic, right?
Is that, yeah, exactly.
It's only tragic, right?
It ain't funny at all. Andrew Pessin is our guest, and he is a writer. And you've got some really interesting titles in your nonfiction categories, like The Study of Philosophy. Is that a book that's going to put you to sleep? Is that required reading in your class? How does that work?
That is my one book that was designed to be a textbook. So I have assigned it in my classes. I actually don't love it as a textbook for philosophy for reasons even though it's my own textbook. But it is a textbook. It's a very useful book if someone's interested in just getting a good overview of what it is that philosophers do. It's got a little bit of a historical component and also a contemporary component. I don't think it puts people. I try to write in an engaging fashion. I will mention one of my other books on philosophy. Some of my nonfiction books are philosophy books for the general reader. So I have one called The 60-Second Philosopher, which is a series of very short essays. I think they're about 300 words, 300 to 350 words each. So you can read them in about a minute and a half or 2 minutes, despite 60-Second Philosopher. And each one addresses an interesting question or an idea or a problem or a paradox or something like that from philosophy, just to get you thinking. And at least the feedback from that book, that's one of my, I think, 2 best-selling books, has been very, very positive. Philosophy, I think, is and should be and can be a lot of fun, and also funny, because I find humor in a lot of things, but certainly it can be fun. The opposite of putting you to sleep. The idea is to get you sort of energized and engaged. And I'm confident I succeeded in The 60-Second Philosopher. And the same kind of writing goes into the textbook, although it's a little bit heavier because it's a textbook. So I hope it's not a snoozer. I suppose I'd have to ask my students to find out what they think.
They're your students. They're not going to tell you.
I know. I'll say, well, if you give me a good response, you can get an A. So how do you feel about the book?
How do you feel about it now?
Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. By the way, again, we're talking with Andrew Pessin. Go to his website, which is andrewpessin.com, PESSIN.com. Now, you're an educated man, and I'm not so much. I came from the school of hard knocks, so
all right.
We need to take a quick break. And when we come back, I'd like you to explain to me what goes on in a philosophy class in college, because I have no earthly idea.
Happy to respond to that.
Very nice. We'll be right back after this station break.
You're listening to Brushwood Media Network, the best in syndicated talk, news, and entertainment shows.
As you go about your daily life, look closer. As you gather with family and friends who love and support you, look closer. There are youth right in your community who don't have the home, warmth, and healing you have. So look closer. Every year across America, a staggering 4.2 million youth are homeless or trafficked. And for 50 years, Covenant House has worked relentlessly to keep them safe and protected. Tonight, 2,000 young people will sleep safely in a Covenant House bed. And tomorrow, they will wake up surrounded by love. They get clean clothes, hot meals, medical care, and a safe place to sleep. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In sites across America to help them fulfill the great promise of their lives. So look closer at Covenant House. To help or get help, go to covenanthouse.org.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. I gotta tell you, Andrew, that song is from our youth. A nice heavy metal rock song. Anyway, but we're talking with Andrew, and he is an author. He does fiction. He does nonfiction. He's got, as near as I can count right here, he's got 4, 5 books that surround philosophy in one. Is 5 the right number?
It's in the right ballpark. I don't have my list in front of me, but yeah.
Well, see, the book Gray Matters, which I thought might be a Civil War thing about the South and
Nope, philosophy.
Philosophy, and the Twin Earth,
Which surprisingly is philosophy also. That sounds a little science fiction-y, but that's actually a philosophy book.
and the when it's the Modern Scholar.
That is a philosophy audio course and book.
Oh, very nice. And
So if anyone wants to listen to me lecture about philosophy, that's a place to go.
So when you're in your classroom and it's day one, what do you tell your class that we're going to be talking about in this class?
So that's a fine question. And how many day ones have I had? I've had too many, more than I want to count, even though I'm a young man, as you so kindly called me earlier.
Yes, you are.
So, most students, if we're talking about like a philosophy 101 class, almost all students or almost no students have ever had philosophy or have any idea what it is. It's rarely taught in high school. In some places it is, or a little bit of it is, but most of them haven't heard of it. And so I don't know how they end up in a philosophy class. The word is intriguing to some, philosophy. And so just out of curiosity. And so day one is usually spent giving a little sense of what it is we do as philosophers. And I don't want to keep your audience for these 75 minutes that I normally have on a day one philosophy 101. So I'll try to condense that, and you can give me the cut if I'm going on too long. But so the way I would try to begin to describe it, and first of all, the ultimate goal was not for me to lecture at a student, although I can, paid by the word, remember. I can teach them what certain philosophers said about certain issues or questions. The ultimate goal is typically to get students to learn how to philosophize themselves. Philosophy, rather than a thing, is really an activity. Philosophizing is a way of thinking about things. And like riding a bicycle, you can't learn to do it until you can hear lectures to the end of time, but you're never going to ride a bike until you get on the bike and do it yourself. So the goal is to get students to learn how to do it, not just simply tell them about it. But on day one, I might begin with some introduction into the typical kinds of questions philosophers are interested in and the kinds of methods philosophers use to think about those questions. So roughly speaking, the domain of philosophy divides into three areas, which go by the imposing names of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. So I can stop there, or I can carry on. So all right.
You're on a roll.
Metaphysics is a hard word to define. It's kind of, it when you see it, but roughly speaking, metaphysics is the study of the fundamental nature of reality. What exists and what is the nature? What kinds of properties do existing things have? And I can happily elaborate on that. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. What does it mean to say we know something? What are the conditions under which things count as known? What are the different kinds of knowledge and how do they relate to each other? And ethics, roughly speaking, is the study of values. So whereas metaphysics and epistemology very much want to describe how things are, this is what exists, this is what its nature is. Ethics, or value theory, studies how things should be or ought to be. However things are, when we say something is good, or we say something is the right, meaning like the right action to perform, what we're saying partly is you ought to do that thing. You ought to pursue that thing, whether or not you are pursuing it or are doing it. So ethics is the study of what should be and what ought to be, whereas those other domains are the study of what is. And that's actually a pretty profound distinction there. So that's the domain of philosophy. Those are the kinds of questions. So in ethics, you will ask questions like, what is the difference between good and bad and right and wrong? How are those words even related to each other? Is good the same thing as right? Is wrong the same thing as bad, etc.? How do we know? And I'll go a little further into this one. How do we know what's good and bad and right and wrong? And the reason that's a problem is when we're talking about how things are in the world, one way we know how things are is with our senses. You can say like, oh, there's an apple on the table and it's red. How do you know that little bit of information about the world? Well, you see it with your own eyeballs, let's say, right? So you can learn how things are with your senses, but what you cannot sense is how things ought to be or should be. If you're watching, let's say, some bad or evil action, I don't know, somebody's like beating up a child or something terrible like that, you know that it's a wrong thing to do. An innocent child should obviously never be harmed, etc. But you don't see the wrongness with your eyeballs. You can see the physical activity, but the thing that makes it wrong is not itself visible. So that raises the question, like, well, then how do we know it's wrong? What's the basis of our moral knowledge? And in that way, the different areas of philosophy all intersect. So that's a question of epistemology. How do we know? But it's also about values. How do we know what's right and what's wrong? How do we know what we should do and what we should not do? So that's sort of the subject area. Jump right in.
I've got a good one for you that
All right.
run by and see what you think. 50 years ago, maybe 50. You know, the sad thing is 50 years ago was 1974.
That's like yesterday.
I know.
I'm with you.
So
yesterday, recently,
I got to go back even a little bit farther. So we'll say you're in the 1950s.
50s. Okay.
Marriage was the expectation.
Yeah, right.
Living together was highly discouraged and frowned upon, and you were living, quote unquote, you were living in sin. And if you were living in sin, you're probably going to hell.
Right.
Fast forward 70 years to today, and there are psychologists that'll tell you, well, you know, maybe you should try living together for a while before you get married, because you can find out more about the other person, and the chances of your marriage succeeding are far greater. So something that was clearly the rule of the land 70 years ago today is completely different. So does that mean that our ethics are changing, or what does that mean?
So we could have a whole semester on that question right there. It's a fantastic question, right? So ethics changing, but if you think of values as being real objective features of the world, like there's a real fact of the matter about what's good and what's bad. It's not just what we feel, but it's a fact about the world somehow, then values shouldn't change in that way. So maybe what we could say is we were wrong then and we're right now, or maybe we were right then and we're wrong now, or you immediately get into questions, of course, of moral relativism. Well, some societies do it this way. Some societies value marriage, not living together. Other societies value living together. Can they both be right when those are opposite values? That's a very interesting and bizarre claim, because normally if there's one fundamental rule or law in philosophy, it's called, the fancy name is the law of non-contradiction. You can never accept a contradiction. Contradictions are terrible things from the perspective of a philosopher, for reasons I could elaborate on. And a contradiction, of course, it comes from the Latin. Contra means against, diction means to speak. So you contradict yourself when you speak against yourself, when you both say something and then reject it at the same time, right? And what we have, so for philosophy, you can never accept a contradiction. They can't both be right. If one says P and the other one says not P, one of them's wrong, right? They can't both be right. But when we talk about values, many people are attracted to some form of moral relativism, which is a way of saying, well, if we do it this way, that's fine. If another society does it another way, think about, I don't know, just women's rights or something like that. In many countries around the world, women have essentially no rights whatsoever. They can't even show their skin in public, right? Whereas in Western society, women are liberated to some large degree, to use a 1970s sort of term. So the question is, are both societies right? That this is the way we do it and that's the way they do it? But those are opposite values. One says women must be modest and private, and the other one says women do not have to be modest and private in the same way. They should be able to do whatever they want. So it's a contradiction. Normally, no one accepts a contradiction, but weirdly, when it comes to values and ethics, many people are attracted to moral relativism, but that's to accept a moral contradiction, which they probably shouldn't, because contradictions are bad things. So,
and I'll throw a third one in there. Not only are there people that got married and people that were living in sin, but then you have people with arranged marriages who might not even know their husband.
Amazing, right?
And before they got married, and yet they are expected to be happy in their marriage and stuff.
Right. And some I don't know what the, empirical studies are, but, some arranged marriages are fine, others are not. But, I actually think empirical studies show that people who live together before marriage tend not to stay together, even to this day. I seem to recall that factoid. So
Yeah.
maybe it's not such good advice to live together first, but, there's many confounding factors there. It might be that, well, we probably don't want to get into stuff, but those who accepted those values, as you said, 70 years ago, back in the 1950s or so, probably had an idea of marriage as a very profound and maybe even sacred commitment. And if that's your concept of marriage, then you're going to stick in that marriage, right? Because it's very hard to leave that marriage if you think it's incredibly binding and sacred commitment. And so back when people didn't live together, maybe before marriages might have lasted longer because marriage was conceived very differently than it is today, certainly in, I would say, the United States in the year, what year are we now? 2024-ish, right? Right, where marriage is, first of all, marriage isn't that important. People push off marriage. You get married because it's useful or convenient or because you like the person, but then when it's no longer working out, you separate, you break up the marriage. Marriage is conceived very, very differently here. But this is a perfect example. These are values. Is marriage valuable in some deep way, or is it not? And obviously different societies approach it in different ways. And are they all equally good? So it really doesn't matter what you do. But that doesn't seem like ethics isn't. When we think of ethical concerns, we think, no, you should do this. This is the right thing to do. Moral relativism allows you to say, well, it really doesn't matter what you do. You could do it or you could not do it, and it's all equally good. That doesn't seem right, and yet people are drawn to moral relativism with its contradictions. So we might do that. That might be, you could easily be a student in my class and you would raise that question on day one when I was talking about epistemology and ethics, and then we would have a 45-minute discussion on these things.
And which would be really good, because I have two friends from high school, and one's been married 3 times, and the other one, he's my age, obviously, and he just got married for the 4th time. And I said to him, why don't you just go get a dog? Now, is that philosophy?
Yes, that's philosophy. Of course, that's philosophy. That it would be wiser or more effective, or maybe it would make you happier to just have a dog than keep getting married. On the other hand, the famous Margaret Mead, sociologist. She was a sociologist, right? Anthropologist, sociologist. She was a famous academic, and she apparently said the following. Someone asked her how many times she'd been married. She said, I've been married 5 times, each one successfully, she said. So with the idea being, to project some thoughts there, like each marriage was the right thing at that time with that person. And then when, I don't know, she or they moved to new places, it was time to move on to a different marriage. And each one served the purpose that it needed to serve at that point in her life. And that's a kind of healthy attitude, I suppose. So maybe you can share that with your friend.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and then in the olden days, when my parents they got married about 1951, I think it was. And in those days, you got married, you stayed together. They were both Roman Catholic, and they stayed together.
There you go.
But they did not have what I would term to be a close, loving, exciting, vibrant relationship. It was one of those where they got married, they had a couple of kids, and then they were stuck. And so one worked a lot and the other one stayed home. So, values wise, it wasn't very good for the family, but it ended up, that's what they did. So I would, I'm discovering that I would love to take a philosophy class. I think
you should. And you know what? I'm sure they are available, whether it's University of Washington or other universities where you are. There absolutely will be like adult education courses or things you can take, like just a single course or audit a course. I urge you to check it out. Philosophy, it's easy to make fun of philosophy. Maybe you're doing that behind the scenes, and lots of people do. But the reason I went into it is I find it, first of all, fun and valuable in all sorts of ways. And it just teaches you to see the world in a deeper way that makes one appreciate, at least it helps me appreciate things a lot more deeply. So I think everyone should try a philosophy course and see if it's for you. And they are available.
And it amazes me because you talked about relativism, moral relativism and stuff. It's like there was a guy 4 years ago that was having an interview in a van or something, and he was talking about how he could have his way with women, whatever he was doing, because he was a powerful guy. I'm not going to use his name, but he was a powerful guy and stuff. Well, and that got out as far as that he could grab a woman by her private parts, and that would be
that sounds familiar. I think I might know who you're talking about.
And the word got out, and so people were taking the attitude that because normally they would say, "What do you think about a man who says that it's okay for him to grab a woman by her private parts?" And they would say, "That's despicable. That's awful. We could never do that." But then when it turns out that it's him, it's like, "Oh, it's just boy talk. It's just locker room talk. He didn't mean anything." But it's like, isn't that moral relativism?
So that's a very good question as well. You should have gotten yourself some more edumacation, as you put it earlier. I think you would do well with you, but it could be if you say, in certain contexts, this behavior is acceptable, and in other contexts, it's not acceptable. But what makes that not relativism really is we're acknowledging that there's a different context. Moral relativism is really a phenomenon where you say it's okay if you do it and it's not okay if they do it, and those are equally legitimate, but all the relevant information or context is the same between the two places. So
that's been going on for
yeah, right
thousands of years.
No, it's actually a very old idea. If you find out more information about something and change your mind, that can be fine, right? That's healthy, right? We form opinions based on the information available to us at the time. And we hope that when more information becomes available, you might be open to changing your opinion if the information leads you that way. So there's nothing wrong with doing that. In the case you're mentioning, I think I hear what you're getting at, which is that, am I allowed to use his name, or you don't want to use the name?
Oh, you can. No, you feel free.
All right. So in the case of Trump, you have someone who's just, a MAGA, committed MAGA person, then Trump can do no wrong. If the person says, when I hear about this behavior in the abstract, I think it's wrong, but then when Trump does that behavior, it's okay. Well, that's a problem, right? That's not acceptable, because if the action is wrong, it's wrong no matter who does it. So that's a problem. However, if it's a matter of you heard someone said this and it sounded offensive, but then you learned more about the situation, and there is such a thing as I don't know, the way guys talk in a locker room or something. This is a little old school, I suppose. You're not allowed to say things like this anymore, but when you're talking in a locker room, there's a set of assumed rules. People know that can I say a bad word? Talk shit in the locker room, right? People know you don't have to take the words too seriously in a locker room. It's not so meaningful. And so when you find out that phrase is said in a locker room, it actually might have a different meaning than if it's said in a completely different context, right? Or if it's said by, when you think about the famous, rock stars of the 70s and 80s or something like that, and that would have women groupies throwing themselves at them. That person has a very different life experience than me, who has far fewer women throwing themselves at him, right? So, for a guy who every night another woman's throwing himself at him, he's going to have a very different view of the world, and that's maybe a legitimate view given his set of experiences in the world, than someone else saying, I'm just going to go ahead and grab women by their private parts, who doesn't have that set of experiences. So the very same utterance can be really offensive in one context and much less offensive in some other context. So we have to have some nuance, and that's what philosophers do best. We maybe too much, right? Sometimes you want to be black and white. This is good, this is bad, etc. But when you're thinking things through, you'll find out that the world is more complicated than you realize it is. And the complications are actually very beautiful and attractive. Once you start learning about them, you realize, every issue connects to every other issue. And I can't really make up my mind about this until I make up my mind about 10 other things. That can be a little daunting sometimes. And in the real world, sometimes you do just have to make up your mind. But when you have the leisure, and it is a leisure activity, to do philosophy and think about things, you'll start realizing everything in the world is connected to every other thing. And it's really beautiful. It's really beautiful. And I'm happy to spend, I sometimes use this analogy, I've never gone scuba diving. I've gone snorkeling a few times, and I aspire to do more because it was almost a spiritual experience. But you go into the ocean, and you discover there's this whole world under the ocean that you were just unaware of before you went in, right? It was in the corner, maybe you went to the beach, you saw the ocean over there, but until you go in and under the water and you realize there's an ecosystem, a whole universe a whole alternative universe there. And you start seeing some things. When I went snorkeling the first time, it was in a tropical place, and these tropical fish under the water, like, oh my God, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. And if someone were to say to you, and by the way, this ocean goes on like for a long, long time, there's a lot of ocean, and maybe it even goes on to infinity, and it's just filled with endless creatures that are all involved in this enormous ecosystem, would you be upset or frustrated by that? Or would you respond by saying, oh my God, that is the most beautiful thing I can even imagine, and I'm just going to spend the rest of my life swimming around and just absorbing as much of it as I can? So the point I want to make is philosophy takes you from the ordinary world, and it's almost as if it transforms that world into this ocean world, and you realize everything's connected to everything else. Everything is actually pretty complicated and sophisticated, and you could spend the rest of your life just working out the way everything is related to everything else, and it's beautiful. It's really beautiful.
If you love the ocean, you become a oceanographer.
You become an I don't know, an oceanographer, because then you're turning it into an object of science as opposed to something you just you want to absorb and engage in. Maybe I should talk to some oceanographers, what drives them. But
exactly.
So philosophy makes things complicated, and sometimes you don't want that. But when you have the leisure to do philosophy, it really can enrich your life in these ways.
It really can. By the way, we're talking with Andrew Pessin, and he's the author. He's done nonfiction. He's done fiction. He is a philosophy teacher in a university. I'd take a class from you. I think you'd be an awesome teacher.
I'd love to have you. I think I'm pretty awesome. I don't know if my students agree anymore. I used to be more awesome, but I entertain myself in the classroom, and I can tell. There are some people who are very well suited, naturals in philosophy, and there's others for whom it is not such a good fit. And I like to say in my intro to philosophy class, by the second day, if there's 25 students in the class, I can identify the 5 or 6 or 7 that are like philosophers, and then the 6 or 7 or 8 for whom this is going to be a long semester. They're not philosophers. It's just not going to connect. And then there's the people in the middle that have to work on a little bit longer. But you can spot the philosophers and the non-philosophers actually pretty quickly.
Yes, indeed. And we need to take a break, but we're talking again with Andrew Pessin. Go to his website, andrewpessin.com, and do me a favor. Do him a favor. Buy the book from him rather than... And the bright college years, a lot of us have fond memories of college years. I don't, because I didn't go there, because I'm not educated.
But you can have these memories now. They can be yours. I gift them to you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We need to take a break. We'll be right back.
They have your eyes. They have your ears. They have your smile. Now all they need is a little more of your time. Make a difference in your child's life, because anyone can be a father. It takes time to be a dad.
And welcome back to Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. That's me, by the way. And we're talking with Andrew Pessin, and he's an author of a bunch of books. And go to his website, which is andrewpessin.com. And one of the books that I am looking at here, I'm kind of going through your catalog. I really like your writing and what you're doing.
Thank you.
And one of the things that is cropping up here again, and I just don't know why. I don't know why people do this, but Poisoning the Wells, which is a book that you wrote about anti-Semitism in contemporary America. It is beyond me, Andrew. Why do we continue to go down that old, dead piece of stuff that doesn't apply to anything or anyone anymore? It's just a label that people use to define somebody else and to make them the other and to make them not. Why do we still do that? I guess that's the philosopher in me. Why do we still do that kind of crap?
So before I go into that dark territory, I just wanted to mention I grabbed this off my shelf. So there's the 60-second philosopher, which is very short, very accessible essays. My cousin said he used to keep it in the bathroom. It's like it was good for 2 essays per session, that type of thing. And I took that as a great compliment. So fun little essays to get people thinking about fun things.
That really is. Okay, so let me strike that last question. Let's talk about that book.
Oh, do you? Okay. Did I just deflect the very dark? Because this is positive talk, right? So
exactly. We don't need to go in one of your essays down the road. I would love for you to write, or you wrote the book. And if you are curious about this topic, get the book, Poisoning the Wells. I personally think we need to be beyond all that and stuff and be positive and care for each other and be kind to each other, regardless of who we are.
Amen.
And so anyway, but the book that you just were holding up,
60-second philosopher.
What is
expand your mind on a minute or so a day. For truth in advertising, we had to say a minute or so because it probably does take like 90 seconds to read the essays, not 60 seconds. But
well, what's interesting about that, Andrew? There's a guy who plays for the Seattle Mariners. He's got a title. And he's the catcher, and he's got a title, and they call him the Big Dumper.
The Big Dumper. All right.
Yeah. So you can have a 1 essay dump, or a 2 essay dump, or a 3 essay dump.
It suits everybody, right? Whatever your needs are. That's right.
And you might, while you're sitting there, you might as well learn something.
You might as well expand your mind while you're expanding your. Oh, I shouldn't say that. Couldn't help it, but you invited it, so you brought that in with the Big Dumper. Now I can't get that off my mind. So, not that I should associate my books with the bathroom, but I suppose that I started that by mentioning my cousin. But anyway,
Andrew, it's a whole industry. There are books out there that are designed. They're just long enough, like comedy books and joke books and stuff. They're designed for you to put by the bathroom so that your guest has something meaningful to do while they're in there.
That's true. Although I suppose today everyone has their phone now, so it is a different era. You could probably get the book. You can get the book that's available as an ebook, so you can read it on your phone. Although I can't stand reading on the phone, but I think is it because I'm old? I mean, my 18-year-old son, he reads everything on his phone, including like textbooks and chemistry books and things like that. It's all on his phone, and to me, it's just not right to read something serious on a little screen like that.
No, indeed. Well, times. I think it was Bob Dylan. Times they be a changing.
They are changing. Yeah, that's the one constant is that things are not constant, as they say. Or as Heraclitus, famous ancient Greek philosopher, said, "You can't step into the same river twice." And someone responded to him by saying, "Well, you can't even step into the same river once." But I don't even know if I get that. Let's see. What is the joke there is, it doesn't make sense to say I step into the same river once, because if it's only once, the idea of same doesn't apply. Anyway, the point of his original saying, you can't step into the same river twice, clearly is that things are always on the move, things are always changing, and nothing's the same from moment to moment. Bob Dylan was basically plagiarizing from Heraclitus, I think is the take home from that.
Exactly. Well, I wouldn't know that, but that's really cool. Andrew, I have enjoyed this conversation immensely.
Likewise, it was a lot of fun.
It was great. Now we've got just like 30 seconds. Is there anything that you would like to tell our audience that they don't already know?
That I don't know what they know and don't know, but I can tell you, A, philosophy is a lot of fun and worth pursuing, worth checking out, and B, do check out my novel, Bright College Years. I had a great time writing it. I laughed out loud many, many times. And it's also, it captures a certain period in life, whether you've been to college or not, it captures that period. Or at least it aims to capture that period. So check that out if you didn't already know that.
To be young and fit, and to have women all over the place
throwing themselves at me, right? Like, and you could just grab them at will. That's how I remember it. The novel is actually told from the perspective of an older person looking back on those times. So it is also about, how we relate to earlier, often less palatable versions of ourselves. So it gets into some deeper things as well.
And here's a philosophy point for you. You're never going to be as good looking as you were when you were 19?
Or to put that differently, you're never going to be as good looking again as you are now, right? Here's a bit of wisdom, which is, before long, there's going to come a day soon enough when you would give anything to come back to this day, right? Like, if only I could get this day back again. And we don't think about that when we're in this day, right? But right now, I'm busy thinking about the days that are past that I wish I could go back to. But 10 years from now, I would give anything to come back to this time, to be younger again, right? And so we need to appreciate the moment in time that we're in, because one day soon we're going to be longing to return to this moment.
I just wonder if in 10 years I'm going to remember my name, or will I even care?
That's true. That's another possible outcome.
Andrew, thank you so much for being here. Go to Andrew Pessin, PESSIN.com, and and buy the books from him. He's a wonderful guy. You need to come back. We need to do this again.
Anytime. This was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. And I learned something too. That's pretty cool. So,
all right.
Thank you, Andrew.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Positive Talk with Kevin McDonald. Our purpose is to provide everyone with a positive, entertaining, and educational experience. I would love your feedback and comments about the show, including possible topics and great guest suggestions. Please email me at kevin@kmmedia.pro. And remember, be kind to one another, because each other's all we've got. That's Kevin